Hello, all, and welcome back to another episode of Movies and Us, a weekly gathering place filled with conversations about movies, stories, and connection. My name is Jennifer Hahn.
And I'm Sarah Callan.
And today we are going to be reviewing the latest Scorsese film, Killers of the Flower Moon. And we are joined by a very special guest. You've heard him on the pod in the past, Philip from the Substance Pod. Philip, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hey, thanks for having me back, guys. This is a pleasure. Yeah, Scorsese's my guy. I loved listening to you guys in Scorsese September, and I was just thinking today. I didn't really realize this earlier, but this is my second Rodrigo Prieto movie with you guys. He's been having a heck of a year.
Yeah, good stuff. We're excited to have you for this conversation. I think this is going to be a really good conversation about this film.
We'll see if we can keep it to an hour.
I know, right? Yeah, when there's an absolute masterful behemoth like this, you just want to just dive into all of the pieces. Yeah, we'll try. All right, Sarah, do you want to kick us off with an IMDb summary for Killers of the Flower Moon?
Sure. When oil is discovered in 1920s Oklahoma under Osage Nation land, the Osage people are murdered one by one until the FBI steps in to unravel the mystery.
All right. And in the traditions of this podcast, we will kick off with our one-sentence summaries for Killers of Flower Moon. And as our guest, Philip will have you share yours first.
Was America a mistake?
Oh, I love it. I love the spice. Very fitting, very fitting. Sarah, what was yours?
Mine is never let a coyote into your home.
Yeah. All the literal and figurative ones.
Yep.
Yes.
No matter how blue his eyes are, just don't let a coyote in.
Keep him out. Keep him out. Mine is in every aspect of filmmaking, Scorsese scores with this one.
Beautiful.
Nice.
All right. Let's start off with our initial thoughts about Killers of the Flower Moon in this first section. We will not include any spoilers for this film. We will include a spoiler a little bit later and then have full reign. So we'll keep our thoughts a little bit more high level in this first section. Philip, I'm intrigued to hear your thoughts about Killers of the Flower Moon. How did this movie work for you?
Well, I mean, Jen, your one-sentence summary, I couldn't agree more. It's such a delight. I agree with many, many people, both professional and lay critics like myself and like us, who have our platforms where we talk about film. Scorsese is, in my estimation, our greatest living director and one of the greatest of all time. And it's such a joy to have him going this hard as an 80-year-old.
Yes.
The man has been making masterpieces for 50 years. And this, I mean, recency bias, I'm not saying it's in my top 3. It's not. But this is a staggering work that truly stands with his whole entire body of work. He's not fallen off at all. And if anything, if you look at all the press he's doing, it's very exciting. He's the fact that he's 80 seems to kind of give that whole memento mori. He is going who knows how much time I have left? I want to tell these stories that I want to tell as good as I can while I have the time. Him being 80 years old, I think has, in a way that it doesn't for many, has re-energized him to make incredible work. And it's just such a joy to be alive to see it.
Yes, plus 100 to everything that you just said. I'm sure we'll dive into all of those different aspects of what he's done and the choices he made with this film. Sarah, tell us your initial thoughts of Killers of the Flower Moon and how this movie worked for you.
Yeah, no, ×2 to everything you just said, Philip. But this is a really great movie to just experience and allow it to really just wash over you. I was pretty surprised by some of the choices that are made, how some of the technical components come together. But as I've been able to get outside of it, I can see how strategic so many of his choices were in helping you really just sit in this world for a little bit, and you really feel like you are transported back to the 1920s. You feel like you're transported to the Osage Nation. And I think there's just so much in this that is so brilliantly done. And obviously the performances are really great. The writing is wonderful, and I'm just so impressed at, like you were saying, Philip, like Martin Scorsese's willingness to bring this story to the big screen. And I love that people are talking about this story, and he's really shining a light on a story that maybe many of us haven't heard before. And I think that that's also really valuable. So I think as a work, it's very, very well done, but then also thematically, and the things that he's saying with this work are also really important for us to think about and talk about and grapple with. So it's just excellent all around.
Well, and briefly, I'm sure we may talk about it again later in spoilers. Before we started recording, we talked about how encouraging the box office is. Like, this is an
Yes.
Apple movie that's going to be streaming in not too long. And in 10 days, and last weekend, the middle of this week, and then this weekend, we're recording before the second weekend of box office is over. It's already made $85 million. It's a 3.5 hour historical epic about hard things that everybody could see on their couch in a month or so if they just waited for streaming. But people are showing up for it, and that's incredibly encouraging. I think cinema is alive and well.
It really is. It really is. And I think it's also a testament to the way that these creators are using their time, energy, and dollars to fund the things that they are feel passionately about. Like Scorsese is, producing a lot of this and putting a lot of his dollars there. And also Leo, like I think that they're bringing their resources in the right places. Yeah, this film I think is captivating as a technical masterpiece, as a storytelling masterpiece, but also in the process of production and research and the intentionality that Scorsese and his whole team has had with being authentic to the people that they're representing is so important and so meaningful. I think that we've seen so many other examples of Hollywood taking people's stories and kind of running with it, overly dramatizing it, making up whole characters in someone's life story that like just don't exist. And for such an important story like this, his level of effort to bring the Osage Nation to be a part of the process and to be a part of the filmmaking process is just like another layer of like morally and ethically the way that this creator is dedicated to telling these stories that I just respect so heavily on top of all of the other things that this film is doing in a really incredible way. I read half of Killers of the Flower Moon, the David Gran book, and I stopped at the halfway point because I was like, I want to like experience it in the theater and Scorsese's rendition of it. But some of the choices that Scorsese's made and how the book presents the storyline and how he's presenting the storyline, I think is really fascinating too. Really focusing on the people and the human beings that are part of the story and not so much on the like investigative journalism like murder crime aspect of it. I think it's just also like a very very indicative of his style, which is to focus on the people and the human experience in the story, beyond just kind of the melodrama of it all. So man, there's so much for us to talk about with this
So
one.
much. It is
It's
such a
just
rich movie.
a
I mean,
feast.
you're talking about, I'm sure we'll get back to it, but I just, I've been I watched the movie last week and have gone through periods where I'm just thinking on it and then listening to podcasts, reading interviews. I read or listened to something recently. I forgot where it was, but someone told the story of David Gran visiting the set and like being so impressed and also like learning from them. So Jack Fisk was the head of production. He's Terrence Malick's guy. He doesn't do a whole lot of like big like blockbuster movies. It's very much like more, but I mean Martin Scorsese, like he's the only one that could have made this movie this way. I don't know how much we want to get into it. There's different people. There's I don't even want to say controversy, but I think there is a conversation about how this movie was framed, who told it, what story was told, and I think that's a very interesting conversation. I'd be happy to have that, but I think that the fact that this story was told in this way. Really, only Scorsese could have done this first. Like, Native American representation, unfortunately, has not been great in the history of cinema, and I really feel like, not that there haven't been any, but like really only in the last few years has it started to like come up in a way that has seemed genuine, that from what I've read and seen and heard, like people who are in the Native American community say, yes, like this is indicative of my experience, not just telling a story of natives. So I mean, I'm so grateful that he got to do it. But all that to say, like, they put so much effort and attention. I heard a story about David Grand visiting the set and like learning, going, oh, like this is how this works. Like they had recreated it so well. He's like, oh, I was interested in this. Like, to like him learning from the production department more. And he spent years and years and years writing the book on it.
Yeah, yeah, and the intentionality of Scorsese and team to like meet with and spend time with and cast people from the Osage Nation to just like they are fully integrated in every aspect of the filmmaking, not just let's cast some actors that are this way, or like that amount of research takes effort, time, money, and they're willing to spend that. Yeah, and so like you're saying that Philip, the even David Grand, who spent that much time with the Osage Nation and listening to their stories, is still learning from this team that is like really dove headfirst in.
I love it.
Incredible.
And for what some people maybe have stuck their nose up, but if you look at the box office receipts, like people are going to see this. Like this is a
Yeah.
movie that I would say, like, if I was a history teacher, like show this every semester. Like this
Yeah.
is, and not just, oh, this is like a pure history. It is very historically accurate, but I don't know if we want to get into it now or save it to later. The perspectives purposefully that the story was told from, I think, is very important and only adds to the legitimacy of Martin Scorsese being the person to tell this story in this way.
Yeah, let's include a spoiler here so we can dive right in, have free reign over all of the plot points that happen in this movie. So, if you haven't seen Killers of the Flower Moon yet, what are you doing with your life? Please get your butt to a theater. This is try and see this on the biggest screen possible with the best sound effects possible and audio quality as well. It's worth every every bit of
And not
money
at one of
investment.
those theaters that is artificially adding an intermission to it that Thelma is furious
Yes.
about.
Yes. That's a whole topic that we can dive into too. Oh my gosh. Yes. Okay, so Philip, tease out that thought that you were having now that we can talk about any of the spoilers that happen in this movie.
So Martin Scorsese, I mean, you guys covered Casino, because yeah, the other two were
Okay,
not
Casino.
really the
Yeah,
crime ones. So yeah, you guys covered Casino in Scorsese
heard
September.
in. Hmm.
Under both underrated and recently kind of annoyingly overrated in my book, but 5-star masterpiece from Scorsese. Not better than
Yeah.
Goodfellas. That's an annoying take, but it is a masterpiece. But
Hmm.
Scorsese's crime epics, like yeah, Goodfellas, Casino, The Departed somewhat, but more like The Wolf of Wall Street's, where like he really puts you
Yeah.
in to a corrupt system with corrupt people that you see the draw of and you identify with and you completely understand why they're drawn into the world, why they do what they do, and even if you're obviously like morally in disagreement with it, it all makes perfect sense. I think it is a little bit different. Like this is more okay. There's just so much. It's hard to kind of keep on a straight thought here. Like
I know. I love
it's
it.
such a massive work. So all that to
Mhm.
say, Killers of the Flower Moon, I think similarly to The Irishman, is a
Mm.
more reflective. It is very
Yeah.
on its face, like if you were maybe like an alien and you saw this and you didn't have any context, you'd be like, these things are similar. Like these tropes, like they're doing the same thing. Guy gets introduced to this corrupt system, he becomes a part of it. But I really think with the Irishman, and particularly this one, it is completely stripped of glamour. Irishman, I liked the device in the Irishman where they showed like as characters were introduced, they like had a little blurb of like how they all died, and it was usually pretty grim. But I did think I liked it. I thought that was a little bit heavy handed, but I think with this one, it was done so well of like, we are, in we being generalized, like, we are earnest, and and the evil and corruption doesn't have to be purposeful. It doesn't have to be hateful. Scorsese has far and wide told the story of meeting with the Osage people and coming to the deep conviction that in some way that Ernest and Molly truly loved each other. So the question is, how can somebody who loves somebody do the things that Ernest did to his wife? So I think that this movie is a fascinating wrestling with like the nature of evil, particularly in the US. Like, we've got a rugged history that in the last several years, many people have decided to engage with afresh. Many people have decided to dig in their toes and refused to engage with. But I think this movie shows that like there doesn't have to be hate. Like, you don't have to be a bad guy to be engaged in a like in the film, like the system of white supremacy and superiority that truly executed evil, not out of hate, not out of malice, but out of superiority. Like, they talked about it many times and it was chilling. Like, the Osage were not viewed on the same level. They talked once about like you could get legally more in trouble for animal cruelty than you could for murdering an Indian in the street. So like, what does that say about us? And that's why I kind of tongue in cheek my one sentence was America a mistake? Like, this is built into the fabric of who we are. And I love Goodfellas. I saw it probably too young, and from a young age, like, I wanted to be a gangster. I got it. Like, those are like, I had
Yeah.
a couple of uncles. They weren't very high up. I had a couple of people in my family who were lightly affiliated, and I just like,
Mm.
that's rad. You can do whatever you want, no consequences. There were a lot of consequences. You just didn't see them. Like, you give up your soul, and in a lot of instances that he showed in The Irishman, these lives don't end well. Like, you can have some opulence, you can have some wealth, you can have nice clothes, nice food, go on trips, the whole Wolf of Wall Street. You can do all these things, but you give up your soul, and in the end, it's not a happy ending. And I think this really showed kind of how that has been part of the system of America from the beginning, and that's a lot of people don't want to have that conversation, but I think framed in that way, like, this isn't, oh, like, what's the experience of a Native America in the 1920s? No, like, this is what is America. And I think that Scorsese is perfectly and maybe most qualified to tell that story.
No, that's so good. Plus 100 and times two to what you shared. And I think that you bring up a really fascinating point, which is that Scorsese's landscape of morality that he paints in this film is a lot more complex from what we often see and some of his earlier work as well. This is clearly a man who's thought incredibly deeply about the human experience and how people get intoxicated by the systems of its superiority. I think that the foil between Ernest and Hale is really interesting because I think Hale is the type of character that we often see in films and we've seen in some of his previous films that is just purely like greedy out for what he wants. He's gonna get it, and he has no sense of morality or conscience about some of the actions that he takes, right? Ernest, I think as the film ended, I was so conflicted about him because I think that the version of Ernest that we probably would have seen in previous Scorsese films is a dramatic rise and a dramatic fall, right? And that fall is often really fascinating for us to see in a lot of Scorsese films. The men who fly too close to the sun and they just tumble, absolutely tumble. Ernest is really fascinating because he doesn't have that hard fall. Even in the end, when he's deciding which side to take in this whole case and testify or not testify, he doesn't have a sense of morality. He's almost absolutely lost and devoid of where he believes is right and wrong. And you see that as most, I think, clearly in that final conversation that he has with Molly, where he
Oof,
still
man, that was brutal.
has not like repented for the things that he's done, come to see himself clearly, and then make the right choices. He doesn't at all. And I think
Very
we look at his
American,
man.
also, right there.
Yes, yes, exactly. So he's really almost intoxicated and lost in all aspects. He has no loyalties to his previous evil, Hale regime that he was a part of. But he also has not really come to clarity around what he's done and the choices that he's made and the systems that he's been a part of. He's almost floating still by the end. And we as viewers don't even know where he lands. And I think that ambiguity is really interesting and really fascinating. And then you weave that into what you were saying earlier, Philip, around this love and this affection that he does seem to have that feels genuine for Molly, and throw that into the mix. And it's a really, really interesting concoction.
I want to hear what Sarah says. I feel like
Yeah.
I talked a ton, but I just on the Hale note, when I first saw it, I was like completely evil. Like this is like full on wolf in sheep's clothing, like full on evil. And I don't like I'm not saying that that is not true, but the more I've been thinking about it, like I think both Scorsese and his co-writer and looking into like the genuine history, like yes, he was, but he wasn't like evil in a vacuum. Like he wasn't mustache twirly. There was a scene where a character who was in a handful of scenes, one of the natives who was a confidant of Hale's, who was and he mentions him as like this is one of my best friends. Like I don't think that that was like a lie or deception. Like there had to have been some levels of self deception within them, but I think because what Scorsese and company are doing is really identifying like the wicked corrupt systems is like Hale is kind of a very dumb criminal mastermind. Like a lot of the criminals in this are very dumb, and like all they took was like an actual outside law person. Like the FBI literally just started. They had a lot of their people had no experience, and all they needed was somebody from the outside to be like, everybody's guilty. Like Scorsese joked, he jokes a lot on the press trail. Like when they were first developing it, like well, it's a procedural, but then we realized like this isn't a who done it. Like it's maybe a who didn't do it, and that list is very small. Like it's all about how everybody was a part of this bad system that did corrupt them. But like when you look at even Hale, it's like he saw himself as other and above, and like his discussion with Ernest at the beginning, he's like, our people are on our way. Like our money's drying up. Like we need to do this. Like in the game of capitalism, it like if I'm gaming this out, like we're gonna be losing in the future if we don't play our cards right and more but but that doesn't engage with the moral aspect of in order to win the game of getting more money, you have to systematically not just rob people or kill people or take their money, like befriend them, marry them, have children with them, get in their wills and then murder them, and then legally like it succeeds to you. Like it's not just robbery, it's so insidious because of the relationships that had to be had in order for that theft to occur.
Well, and one of my favorite parts of this film is that they put that in conversation with the destruction of Black Wall Street that also happened in the 1920s in Oklahoma. And so I think that those are two really interesting parallel tracks of how white supremacy just can't handle any people of color having power or wealth. And so I think it's really interesting viewing those two things side by side and in conversation with each other. And you see, the overt racism, and you could say that what we see in Killers of the Flower Moon is almost more like covert racism, and just the destruction and the theft that comes from that. Not just, it's not just a murder of one person, but it is murder of, people's lineage, and generational wealth is destroyed. And you can see even like the health effects, and how the Osage people are carrying the effects of these traumas in their bodies too. And I feel like there's just so much there that white supremacy is so destructive, and we see that play out in a number of ways in this film. And I thought that that was really, really intentional and really, really poignant to include.
No, that's so good. And I think something that's really unique about this story is how insidious it is to have those relationships be a part of the criminal activity. And this is something that both Philip, you mentioned, and Sarah as well. Of it's a totally different dimension and method of manipulation to do it that way than just pure crime. Like, let's just go out and whack them, like you've seen in some of the other
Yeah, like
mafia
the
films.
Goodfellas and Casino crime of,
Yeah,
like, we're gonna rob a truck, we're gonna rob a restaurant, we're gonna
yeah,
rob a safe house.
yeah.
That's different than, like, we're gonna get our people to marry your people and slowly murder them,
Mhm.
their family members at that point, for your wealth.
Mhm.
That's a completely different thing.
Yes. Yeah. And the like relational dynamics that are at play there as well. Something that I thought was so interesting is that the book, again, I've only read half of it, but it starts with Anna's murder from the beginning of the book. And everything is positioned as, like you were saying, Philip, more of this like investigative journalism, this procedural into the whodunit of, and that's the first half. Maybe the second half is different. I don't know. But the first half starts with Anna's murder, and then the rest of the story kind of envelopes and opens up from there. This Scorsese has chosen to focus on this love story between Ernest and Molly in the first, 1/3 of this film. It actually lasts quite a long time in the grand scheme of things. Um, and we get to know these two people
And you
and
get
see.
sucked in and invested. Like, we haven't
Yeah.
really talked about any of the performances yet.
Hmm.
Uh, Lily Gladstone was incredible. I know
So
she's gonna
good.
have a lot of competition this year, but I mean,
Man, give
I
her
think
all the
that I hope
awards.
we don't have a repeat of The Irishman where it gets 10 nominations and wins nothing. But I mean, if I had to give it to one performer, because I mean, there's so many amazing people behind the camera and technically as well, but I mean, Lily Gladstone was a revelation in this while not doing very much. Like, she
She's
didn't have
so
like a
hard.
big
Yeah.
show. She wasn't Meryl Streep, but she was this character.
Hmm. Which is the harder acting performance to do, I think, that understated, like to emote so much, but not have it be big and melodramatic and over the top, which the Academy loves to reward those performances typically. But I think this is a harder task, even in the moments where you want her to just let it all out at him. She doesn't, and it's part of that that community's culture and the way that they process and express. But my gosh, that's a difficult task. You see it all in her eyes and in the small, like micro, you know, movements in her face and her facial expressions. It's insane.
Because of, like you said, the nature of the story, the Native Americans, while they had a lot of material wealth at that time because of the oil found on their land, they were not uh, kind of in a interesting bit of a both sides. Like, they had a lot of material wealth, yet they were not in power at all. The government rushed to take it from them, impose like the guardianships and all those things, and then the local law, like Hale was essentially like the mayor. He was like a deputy sheriff, like, and he was the one orchestrating all of this murder. Like, they both had a lot of money and no power. So I felt like Lily Gladstone's performance, that like they didn't really have the freedom to really kind of express themselves. So a lot of it was silent. And in their courtship, her silence was so powerful. Like, when she would finally incrementally let him in and give him a smile and laugh at his joke. And like when she invited him inside for dinner, like that felt huge. Like, when you watch a courtship and two people
Yes.
share a meal, that's a normal part of this. But I don't know. I didn't have a timestamp, but finally, like when she's like, "You may come into my house," like that felt so like monumental. Right after she gave him that big hat.
Yeah, yeah, that felt like a huge moment. And then I did love, he walks in and then he turns and you immediately see her mom, and her mom is like, "Mm-mm, nope." this isn't it. I don't want him in my house. I was like, Mom knows what's best. You should listen to Mom because this is not going to go well for you.
Yeah. She was right the whole time. You know, she knew.
And I mean, Leo gave an incredible performance. Wouldn't mind seeing him nominated. Wouldn't mind seeing him winning. But he gives such a different performance. Like he was just straight up like dope in this. Like he wasn't glamorous. Like I mean, he is Leonardo DiCaprio. Underneath all that, like he is a handsome, charismatic guy. But like he played a real idiot in this, like real well.
Yeah, and I think he does a really incredible job of showing and getting us. He does this in so many of his other films too, but especially in Scorsese films of like just an awful human being, but you see the manipulation of the system that he's in and you somehow feel like an ounce of empathy for him because I think the framing of the film itself, actually, that the screenplay does a good job of Hale being this manipulative force to draw him in and to lure him into this like mentality and the propaganda and the mindset that you see him adopt. Because you're right, at the beginning of the movie, he's just kind of this bumbling character who's uncultured, uneducated, like here and just, available now all of a sudden, and you see his transformation and the intensity that he begins to bring that is so different from this kind of sweeter version of himself at the beginning of the film. He's full on like barking out orders to execute, jobs for Hale by the end, and that transformation I thought was maybe more subtle, but pretty effective for seeing Ernest's transformation. He's I'm going to call him a victim of the system, but he also is under the manipulation of the system and the
Yeah.
superiority, and he gets intoxicated by it, honestly.
Well, the progression of his complicity and like explicit actions I thought was super interesting. Like his first conversation with Hale, like he's a veteran, he's kind of aimless, he's not really sure what's going on. And he's like, "Well, I do like women and money." And he's like, "Great. Here's a beautiful woman. She's got a lot of money. Like that's your job. Like go after her and like bring it into our family." And you're like, okay, he's kind of an idiot, but he does really he falls in love with this woman. But then I think the first explicit action you see is him and his brother and another one of the thugs just kind of hold up some natives in the street. And there's a really interesting line of dialogue, something along the lines of like, "You didn't do anything to deserve that," as if like stealing it at gunpoint was
Yeah.
a noble a noble feat. Um, but that's just again the mindset of that superiority. They're like, this, like we're in charge and you have like status. You shouldn't have that. Like, and that's the insidiousness of that white supremacy. It's not because like a lot of these guys, like even if your great great grandparents owned cattle, you didn't do anything to inherit that land, that wealth, that status. These people who were systematically killed a lot, and the people who are surviving, like getting like a grant of land from the government after their people had their land stolen from them, and many of their people murdered. Like they happened to find oil on it, and like the system wouldn't allow that to be, and it's awful. And then that progresses from holding up to, I think I even gasped when, because he is shown as being stupid and like a part of the system, like definitely complicit, but like a little bit maybe in the dark. Leonardo DiCaprio's character Ernest, but then when his wife Molly hires the private detective, they come to town. There is a scene earlier in the movie where it shows a couple of men, but you don't see any faces of like them murdering him. But then they show that scene again later, and you see that Leo's character Ernest was one of the people who murdered his wife's private detective, who came to town to investigate the murders. You're like, oh, like he's not like a kind of dumb guy who's kind of sort of benefiting. Like he's all in. And then, like you said, he's eventually like, okay, we need to find a guy to blow up my sister-in-law's house. Like he is all in.
And I think the scene that really it's subtle, but I think it kind of executes the final judgment on Ernest as a character is the scene where Molly asks him, "What medicine did you give me?" And the turmoil that you see on Leo's face, which they actually never show Molly's reaction to when he just answers insulin and doesn't give the truth at all. But the wave of emotion and turmoil that you see on Leo's face in that scene is brilliant, but also I think is indicative of this movie believes that there is an awareness and a conscience and a clarity that that character does have the capacity to see. He's not a psychopath. Like he knows what he's doing and that's why he feels the guilt. That's why he is emoting in the way that he does in that scene, but he's choosing to delude himself. Like he's choosing to turn the other eye and just not look at the things that he's done. So I think that inclusion of that scene was just so powerful. And the way Leo portrays Ernest in that scene, I think is by the end, there's kind of this back and forth of like, where is Ernest's morality throughout this whole thing? How could a person that loves this person also do all of these terrible things, right? And I think the final judgment on Ernest is he knows what he's doing. He's not deluded, but he's choosing to delude himself. And you see that wave of emotion on his face that I think really reveals it's all we need to see, by the end there.
Well, yeah, his choice to I think you said that exactly right, Jen. Like his choice to delude himself, like the system is evil, uh, but he also like knowingly like put blinders on and went in. And I thought the scene, maybe the best scene in the movie, was where, and I mean, it wasn't even in the realm of reality. Like it was very cinematic, where Molly was extremely, extremely sick. Ernest was in the next room, and then I don't remember because it's been a little while. Either Hale or somebody like set their own place on fire for the insurance money, and like it is just like burning and burning. It's kind of like evokes images of like actual hell, and Molly's suffering. You see Ernest kind of grappling with it, and then in that one instance, instead of slipping a little bit of poison to Molly, he pours it in his whiskey in a very Paul Schrader esque move, drinks it
Yeah.
himself, like kind of like
Mm.
the self flagellation of like, I know that I'm doing this. Because at first he's like, oh, like, this is just gonna like slow her down a little bit. Versus, it's like, investigate that for a second, but he can't. And then like when she presses him with it, like he's still unable to fully, because this all falls apart when you look at it for a second, which a lot of the idols of America kind of do too. And the last several years is us kind of being like, can't do we want to do this? Can we actually look at some of this in a real way together? And I think that this movie at this time with these people, like I rolled my eyes hard at the beginning of the movie when it said like an Apple original film or whatever. I'm like, oh great, like brought to you by the super ethical company Apple. But they gave him $200 million. Who else is going to give him 200 million?
Yeah.
Like it's
Mhm.
so interesting the world we live in, but like that's how this kind of stuff gets made. Like they have the money, Scorsese, De Niro, DiCaprio, they have the clout, and they're telling the story. And I mean, I'm again very very grateful.
Sarah, I'm intrigued to hear your thoughts on a comment that you mentioned earlier around the framing of this film and the choices that Scorsese has made. And I think you had some thoughts there that I want to tease apart that we couldn't in the spoiler-free section, but perhaps you can share a little bit more.
Yeah, I was super surprised at how slow and how quiet this film is. I mean, granted, it is 3.5 hours long, so I should have been more mentally prepared for a slow movie. Uh, but it took me a while to kind of settle into that, and I think that that is so strategic, how slow and how quiet it is, because that really helps transport you back to 1920. We have so much stimulation these days and so much noise constantly going on that they didn't have back then. And then early in the film, Hale comments that the Osage people are quiet and that they're always listening, but they're not always talking. And I love how there's not a lot of like background music in this, a lot of times it's just two people talking. And so then you have to sit in the awkwardness of those conversations. You have to sit in the slowness of those conversations and really feel the emotions, but then also see what's being communicated without being said. And I think that's to what you guys were saying about Lily Gladstone, like that's where she shines because she says everything with her eyes and she doesn't have to say any words. And so I think so many of those stylistic choices made me really uncomfortable while watching, which I think is really fitting too, given the uncomfortable nature of these themes and what this movie is really about. So I think it was so smart to do this movie like they did, slow and quiet, to transport us back, but also to make us uncomfortable as we wrestle with these topics that are worth wrestling with, even though they can make us uncomfortable.
Well, and to do them in the Scorsese fashion too, like Sarah, it was so interesting to me, and I wish I would have been able to see it again. I can't wait to see this again. But the way it would go back and forth between being highly cinematic, very Scorsese feeling scenes of either like plans being made, weddings, funerals, this or that, and then like characters being there in silence. Like the score written by the recently late Robbie Robertson, which was also very emotional for me. I cried a ton in this movie. I don't know about you two. I cried a bunch in it, but a long time music collaborator of Scorsese's. This was his final movie. The scenes that were very cinematic felt very, even though they were very natural and a little restrained, like it wasn't like Rolling Stones needle drops or whatever, but like it felt very Scorsese for the set pieces and the montages where it was like going over a quick period of time. But then there would be long scenes that were completely silent. And you just had to sit here with this is very dumb. This is very obvious. This is very evil. Like, if can anybody speak up at all in this ever? And then when the FBI finally comes to town, like it's almost a funny scene when Jesse Plemons' character shows up at his door and he's like, "I'm here to see about the murders." He goes, "What about the murders?" And he's like, "Well, to find out who's doing them." Like, they never thought that was going to happen. They never thought that was going to happen. And to a good reason, somewhat. Like, they had the money and the power and the reach. They followed two people to Washington and killed them. Like, they thought that their money and their power and their violence could protect them forever. But thankfully, um, even the FBI, who not along, not the greatest historically, like if you look at their entire track record, but which is also very funny. I haven't heard anybody talk about this yet. I haven't been able to come up with like a good joke, but have any either of you guys seen the very terrible 2012 Clint Eastwood, Leonardo DiCaprio, J. Edgar movie about J. Edgar who started the FBI?
Yeah.
Like
I
the
haven't watched that one, no. But Sarah has,
Le-
sounds like.
Yeah.
he is this closeted megalomaniac weirdo who started the FBI, also played by Leonardo DiCaprio. I just thought that that was funny. I was just waiting for somebody to come up with like cutting the two movies together where J. Edgar is sent like Leonardo DiCaprio is sending people after Leonardo DiCaprio, but it's all it takes is like somebody with an outside perspective to just be like, this is all corrupt. But then also you have the guy who was one of the heads of the KKK and Molly's corrupt guardian. Like, he's sitting there on the jury. So like this whole thing is bad. And Scorsese's whole point is like, this is us. This is us. Like, not that we have nothing to be proud of, not that we need to be ashamed of everything or whatever. Like, we can't build our lives or whatever here in this country, but like to be honest with ourselves, like this is where we came from. Are we going to be honest about it? And like, what are we going to do about it?
And the other thing that I loved that we get to see kind of along those lines is Hale says multiple times when the FBI is investigating, like, no, this is Indian land. They are going to investigate. Like the white man's laws don't apply here. And so you see these jurisdictional issues that they're having because they are in Osage Nation. And I just thought that that was so interesting to include, that this man who is able to manipulate the law in order to get what he wants, he understands the system so that he can work it well enough to his benefit. And I loved those little lines. I was like, that's so smart and really gets you into the mind of Hale. And even though he's a dumb criminal in some ways, he's actually really smart too, because he understands his boundaries in some ways, and uses that so that he can not get caught for however long until the FBI does come in.
Well, and he was right. The only reason why, like, the FBI didn't have a stellar launch, and the only reason why they were able to do that is because they're like, give the FBI like Native American jurisdiction. They can have jurisdiction over that. Like, that was really the only reason why they were able to step it. Like, historically, they didn't really cover that in the movie explicitly, but that's the only reason why they were able to come in. And I mean, this guy sitting in Oklahoma probably had no idea about the beginning of the FBI, but they're like, well, we don't really know about this. Like, we're so independent. Like, all these states are independent. Like, when it first started, they're like, what are we going to give these guys jurisdiction over? Like, federal jurisdiction. When it first launched, like, that was a very harrowing and challenging time for them. But they're like, yo, give them Indian cases. Like, let them take care of that. And then thankfully they were actually able to help a little bit on this one.
And I think this also is indicative of um, the relational trust he's also built. Sarah, and we're talking about like Hale's strategy and his the way that he connives and hatches these plans. He's also part of this council of the Osage leaders at one point and like chimes in with a little thought there, right? Like that methodical, long building of relational trust too that he also wields. And I think it's very in line with themes that Scorsese's captivated by around men who are successful for a period of time and their heads kind of get too big and they fall because they've extended beyond the constraints and they believe that they are now invincible. Like even in that conversation that Hale has with Ernest at the end of like, no, they're my friends. Like they're gonna forget. They're gonna trust me. Like he has
Chilling.
yeah, yeah, but
Like the his
mhm,
line of people forget, and like we're living 100 years later, and like
gosh. Yeah.
people are like organizing in order to forget in the present day. Like that was shit. Like honestly, like he said it a couple of times, but his little brief monologue of like people forget was up until we don't want to say this till the very very end, but like up until the kind of meta moment at the very end, his little monologue about how people forget, like don't throw this away, like we just need a brief amount, and he was right. People do forget, and like
Yes. Yep.
that was chilling.
Hmm. No, that's so true because I feel like it's such a it's so indicative of also the heart behind this movie around like we will not forget and we will tell the stories and spend the money and investments and bring the eyeballs and attention to these stories so that we don't forget because honestly you're like we were saying it's right like he's right in a lot of ways up until the uncovering of David Gran of these stories and the atrocities here and then the story this at a larger scale bringing the attention here and using their clout and their fame and their skill sets and their talents like this was a buried story like how many Americans were really aware of what happened here.
And even more now, how many Americans like want to be aware now that it's out there?
Yeah. And I think it's he's saying people forget, but there's an insidious like added layer behind that around we will ensure that they forget and we will create the systems and tell the stories and all of that to ensure that it is also forgotten. You know, like that's it's indicative of us, the collective us, but also it's indicative of I think the systems at play around which stories we are aware of and not aware of too.
Yeah, that whole idea of who gets to tell history, and so I think again that that just makes this movie to me all the more important and impressive that Scorsese and everybody behind this was like, no, this is the story that we're telling, and this story needs to be told in this moment too. And I think that that's really really smart, and I'm glad that they have used their their fame and their money to bring this to the fore, because I had never heard of this story before. So I'm glad that they're shining a light on it, because it is relevant and important to us today.
And like I said at the beginning, the way they're doing it, I think is like dead on the best way to do it, because I've heard some criticisms that I feel like are maybe knee jerk and emotional. They're like, "Oh, they're telling native stories as white guys," and I would push back and saying, "No, Ernest." Like they're like, "Oh, like Leonardo DiCaprio is centered in this story about Native Americans," but it's like, no, this story is about how a dumb guy who didn't mean any harm was part of a system that wreaked unfathomable havoc on generations of people because of privilege and ignorance. Like, that is their story to tell. I hope it opens doors for Native Americans to tell stories from their point of view. But the story that was told in this movie, it's about the perpetrators. And I think like in in the internet culture, people like to be like the outrage gets clicks and things like that. But I mean, I think that immense care was taken in every phase of this production to ensure that the story that they were telling was like theirs to tell while doing everything else to an immaculate degree of specificity, like the pipe ceremony at the beginning, a lot of like the whole production design throughout the entire thing, and then the very final image, like that all rang very true. And everybody who is native that I have read and heard said like that stuff was all good. But some of them who were like maybe upset that it wasn't more from Molly's point of view or the Osage, and it's like that's not like if Scorsese tried to do that, that might have been a little ham-fisted and a problem. But because he did frame it on the both active malicious and the passively eventually to active malicious, like that I think was completely his story to tell.
Yeah, and I hope that this will prove to studios that these types of stories and native stories are important and deserve to be told, and that there's a market for it as well. And so hopefully this will maybe open up doors for more native filmmakers and native writers to be able to tell their stories, so that it's not always just, like a white dude telling the story. But I agree that Scorsese and the whole team did this very very well, and hopefully this will open up doors, for future native stories to be told in the way that they want to tell it.
Yeah, he's got enough self-awareness at this point to know like where to how to bring to light and shed light on stories that are important, but with the angle that he knows that is fitting for his nature, his brand, the things that he's captivated by, the themes that he's captivated by, and use those strategically and not kind of color outside the lines. One thing that I thought was really interesting the more that I think about it after this film is how tasteful and um, respectful this film was for how they chose to artistically showcase some of the difficult subjects that it tackles. I think a lot of other Scorsese films are incredibly kinetic and punchy, and they're big and explosive, and we see a lot of gore, we see a lot of murder, a lot of blood spilt and whatnot. But I thought that they did such an artistic way of giving us the emotional connection to what's happening to these people without showcasing a lot of that the way that he probably would with another type of film. Just that intentionality and the elegance of the way that they chose to tackle that, I thought was really wise of them to do, and also is like very indicative of the amount of like respect and detail orientedness that they had for telling this story. They really took it seriously. The other thing is like a lot of his films also have like really punchy, fun dialogue as well. And I thought that they scaled that back and showed a lot of restraint in that area as well, which I thought was really smart for the subject matter that they were dealing with. So I thought that was really, again, wise on the creative team to be aware of what they're telling the story of.
I feel like I've talked a little bit too much. I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on, even at the end of the movie, like he was being extremely self-aware. I thought about like the nature of a creative commercial endeavor that depicts horror for an audience to consume in ways the way they did that at the end. I'd love to hear your guys' thought on like the final 5 minutes of the movie.
This is everything from like when they're on stage doing the bells
Yeah,
and
it's like
whistles and all
the
the way
old school radio show, basically like a 1920s podcast with like the live sound effects and all that, like little FBI propaganda radio hour.
Yeah, I thought that I got some good laughs in my theater of them doing the little sound effects and whatnot, which I thought was a nice way to at least like begin to bring us out of this world and this story that and we're also like transported in time as well, which I think also helps, which we then transport back again even farther into the future, into present day with that shot of the present day Osage Nation. Um, and it lingers on that shot for quite long. But I thought that the personal touch of Marty delivering that final few lines was really meaningful. That coupled with kind of his intro at the beginning of like this is a story that I've been passionate to tell, and we've gone to lengths to ensure that it's told authentically. I thought that was a really great like bookending of Marty being like, this is near and dear to me, and I am going to deliver these last few lines. And I thought that was just like very tastefully done. How do you end a story like this as well? And what do you want to leave people with? And that cutting to then that final shot of the Osage present day people. And you can tell the color palette is different. It's very clearly present day. I thought all of that was just so artistically done, um, tackling like pretty difficult subject matter. So I thought that was really wise. Yeah. Sarah, what were your thoughts?
Honestly, y'all, I was so distracted during that like radio hour moment. I was having so much fun just like looking at everything that was going on and like, oh, how do you make those sound effects? Like I was totally in that moment. I was like, wow, this is so cool. Thanks for taking me into this. So I think for me it was almost this like, oh my gosh, we have been grappling with these really,
Yeah.
really difficult things for 3 hours. Oh, now we can do something fun. Also, there was a bassoon in the orchestra, and that was really cool to see. And I was like honed in on the bassoon. But I do think that that was a really interesting way to end it because, like we had discussed earlier, we had just heard, Hale talking about, the stories that are told and making people forget. And so all of that is kind of in our minds about what is happening with this story, how is this going to be told, and then we're transported into this like radio show about this story. And I just thought that that was a really interesting uh way to show that. um it was also just fun, the brought to you by Lucky Strike and all of those little like propaganda-y things that were also in there. I thought that that was a really fun way to end it, even though it's a really difficult movie to watch and a lot of really, really heavy themes. Then like you said, Jen, like it's this like you're starting to come out of it, and this is a lighter way to leave. Because I mean, how do you end this movie? I don't know. So I thought that that was a really fun and creative way to land this plane, but it was still honoring and reverential and showed how much care went into telling this story, uh, even though it is kind of, you're pivoting and going in a different direction.
I I agree in a way, Sarah. I thought that all the like they just made all the right choices tonally after 3.5 hours of seeing just unrestrained human evil just destroy lives left and right. In a way, it was a nice little replete. Like my theater got plenty of laughs, but it also works on the level of I wouldn't necessarily want to call it like Scorsese reckoning with his body of work, but looking at what does it look like to commodify stories about violence as a product for people's entertainment. Like that's worth thinking about. That's worth talking about. And like all the silly sounds when you think about it, in light of what we've seen for the last 3.5 hours, going, oh, years and years later, when the FBI wanted to have some propaganda, they had these guys on these little machines going do do do, like this is what happened to everybody, like as entertainment. And not that we can't learn through entertainment. This is how stories get told. Like he is trying to do that, but I feel like he's also in that moment while giving us a chance to breathe, a chance to laugh, going like, but like don't miss the point. Like don't let this become a throwaway piece of not even culture, but like don't let this be like a commodity, like something you go, oh, like that was fun to listen to, like that was thrilling, that was interesting, and then move on. And then when he gets on stage himself and go, Ernest got out of jail, Hale got out of jail, these people, we show you what they did. They got out of jail, like they for good behavior, and they didn't really pay for their crimes. And Molly died far too young, and in her obituary, the murders were never mentioned. That's where we are. And then very gracefully, it cuts to modern day Osage, like they have endured, they have um, come through to a degree, they've persisted, but still they're harmed and hurt, and hopefully part of this is to actually educate, raise awareness so that future generations don't continue to live complicit to these systems. Like I thought in all the ways that was like a perfect ending. And I don't imagine that it's going to win all the awards because it is such a brutal film that does implicate all of its American audience in it, and we don't like that, but I thought it was incredible. Like a valuable
Yeah.
film. Like, and that's what I loved about The Irishman and Silence. Like what he is doing late in his life, it's just so valuable. Like this is such high art, and I'm again so grateful we have him.
One thing that I loved about the choice that they made at the ending too was to end on the shot of the present day Osage Nation celebrating and dancing. I just thought that was such a like wise way to zoom out and not leave us with the story with just the trauma that they've experienced, but to leave us with a note of like there is like a joy and a resilience of this culture that has survived for so long. I just thought that tail end was really smart because they could have cut it from just that shot of Marty talking about the
That
fact
would
that
have
the
been
murders.
so like the
Yeah,
murders were never mentioned. Cut to
cut.
black. You just be like, oh my
Oh,
gosh.
yeah. But there is like a let's zoom out and this culture, these people are so beautiful and resilient and they're not defined by this one story. So I thought that was really wise too. Again, just every little
It's
detail, like you
perfect.
mentioned, Philip. Yeah, so intentional.
The man's freaking 80.
Right.
De Niro is a very old man, even though he
Yes.
just had a child. It's incredible.
It really is.
I hope that everybody gets to see this in a theater if possible, or put your phones down. Try not to pause it at home when it comes out on Apple TV.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Okay. I know we could probably keep talking for hours and hours about this movie, but are there any other last thoughts that you wanted to share, or that really stood out to you about Colors of the Flower Moon before we wrap up?
I mean, it was, yeah, top to bottom. I hope it does get a lot of nominations and awards just so that
Me too.
more people see it so it's not dismissed. Like
Yeah.
Irishman, I felt like got dismissed because, oh, it's a
Yeah.
Netflix movie. It was only in theaters for like, I got to see it in theaters. I was very
I'm
fortunate that
jealous.
it was playing in my market, but like I feel like that one literally was only in theaters for like 7 to 10 days. But this one, I think that Apple is trying to keep it out there for a while. Like, it is important, but it's also incredible. Like, you're like, oh, like these are important movies to see, and usually it means, oh, it's a bummer and it's hard. But like, this is, I feel like he made the perfect movie. Like, it's not my favorite Scorsese movie, but I feel like it's one of his most important. And again, this is like his 27th or 28th dramatic feature, not counting like music documentaries or whatever. And he's like 80 or 81. Like, this is an astounding achievement.
Yeah, agreed. One last thing that I had to say was something that you mentioned earlier, Philip, was around go to watch this at a theater that's not doing the intermission. I too am with Thomas Schumacher. Like, that is awful to do to a piece of work that someone has like agonized over. First of all, how do you know where to put the intermission in? What choice are you making, and what scene, and where that lives? Like, that affects the movie going experience. But two, I think being taken out of this and then being thrown back in again is just a totally different experience. There's a reason that some films are designed with an intermission in mind. Like, there is a structure in place for that, but we can do it, y'all. Like, we can sit for 3.5 hours and engage with important things. We can do it.
And if you need to go around, I'll admit I took like a 90-second pee break. I went super fast. Like, if you need to go real fast, go.
Yep.
Or don't get an extra large drink. Just, if you're going to go, commit to it.
Yeah, agreed. All right. Well, this was our review and discussion of Killers of the Flower Moon. As I mentioned, you can find it available out in theaters. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Movies and Us. And thank you, Philip, for joining for this conversation. It was really meaningful and so important. So we're just so grateful that you spent this time with us. Where can people find more of you, more of your commentary, your thoughts, your discussions, some of your work on the internet?
Best place to find me is over at The Substance Podcast. You can find us at The Substance Pod on a lot of the social medias and type in The Substance in your favorite podcatcher. We're been around for several years now. We're in like our 130s, where we've gone to a bi-weekly show now because we want to keep it high quality, but we're in the faith, culture, and the arts world. We do a lot of films under our Substantive Cinema banner, but I mean, we have folks also like professors, advocates, poets, like actual artists. We recently had a guy on who writes and draws, and I mean, we do all sorts of stuff. We've had a really fun spooky season run, so if you're into some horror movies, we've got some great content for you there. But yeah, check out The Substance wherever you get your podcasts.
They always have really meaningful conversations and like a really great roundup of guests. I'm always so impressed by the type of people that you have on for some really good conversations.
And in the not too distant future, hopefully we'll have Sarah and Jen as well there.
Yeah, we'll keep the fun going. All right. Well, our podcast name sums it up. We're all about movies and the powerful ways we can connect with each other and the world around us. This podcast is about all of us and our shared stories. Everyone is welcome here, and we're so glad that you spent time with us today. You can subscribe to this podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or wherever you tune into your favorite shows. Drop us a rating and review, letting us know your thoughts about Killers of the Flower Moon. You can connect with us on Instagram and Twitter at moviesandUsPod, or email us at moviesandUspod@gmail.com. We will be back next week to discuss Sofia Coppola's latest film, Priscilla. We hope you have an amazing week, and we'll see you next week.